I think part of the value that we found in the first round of innovation awards was actually through the application process, finding out what practices are happening in the higher education institutions that we think are scalable and that we can export to other higher education institutions. And although this proposal is focused on community colleges, in the initial round we looked across all three segments and in many places found that the partnerships between the segments were especially best practices that we felt could be shared statewide.
I think my concern, which I've stated when we discussed this when I was on the subcommittee, was that professors end up spending more time writing grants than actually innovating. So really would ask you to consider whether this is a good use of their time, taking them time away from research and academia and really focused on applying for money. Senator Laura, did you have a comment?
Thank you. Yes, I know that in 2014 we spent $50 million on these innovation awards. What has been the result of these awards? Who received the grants? And what has come about? What are the results been of these awards? Have we obtained what we wanted? I mean, $50 million is a lot of money in the governor's spending plan. And so trying to figure out, did we get what we paid for?
Chris Jossman with the Department of Finance. I think there's a number of ways you can look at it. $50 million was allocated, and it's gone out to 14 applicants, and they're spending it on things that we found to be innovative. So the way the process worked, as some background, we made an application available and asked applicants, what have you done in the past to demonstrate that you have a record of innovation? What are you doing today to demonstrate that you're continuing that innovation? And then how would you what are you doing in the future? And so we selected the committee appointed by the governor and with two representatives appointed by both houses of the legislature, selected 14 applicants. The range of strategies kind of varied widely, as Ms. Costa noted. A lot of it was related to partnerships across institutions, so institutions that had created structures to promote regional collaboration and collaboration across segments. A lot of it was redesigning how instruction was delivered and delivering instruction across the curriculum in a more structured way. There was use of technology was a key theme. So I think it's a little bit difficult to summarize the kind of a single innovation that we found across applications. But I think one of the things that we felt was valuable about the $50 million was that it was allocated differently than institutions typically receive the funds and is being spent differently. And so one of the things that we're working with the 14 award winners on it moving forward is to look at and evaluate the practices that they described in their applications and to determine whether they are having the expected impacts on graduation and completion. I think one of the other benefits that we've found is in highlighting the state's interest on graduation and completion, that we've also leveraged private support. So one of the outcomes of the first awards was philanthropy supporting a network of those 14 winners to continue to support them in collaborating on innovation moving forward.
So how much money have we received in private funds?
The state hasn't received any money for private funds. So individual campuses and awardees are the ones that have used this opportunity and highlighted this opportunity to generate additional private support.
So do we know how much money the universities or the partnerships have received?
Not off the top of my head, but we can certainly ask them.
That would be great to have. And so if you're asking us to invest another $25 million, it seems like we still are not sure in terms of the results of these innovation grants. So yet we want to invest another $25 million for the community colleges. I mean, it just seems like it's premature, don't you think?
One example might be illustrative for you of one of the projects that was funded and the value that we saw. And my colleague can correct me if I have the actual colleges wrong, but there was a partnership between CSU Monterey Bay and Hanford Community College that targeted individuals who were the first in their family to go to college for an accelerated engineering program with high success rates, in which it was a wraparound program between both the community college and Monterey Bay for these students to get an engineering degree, something that typically has quite a few college credits associated with it and a more difficult major. And although it was focused on engineering, we think those are the types of practices and partnerships that could be utilized statewide to improve graduation rates and access for students.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
A little more background on this. As Mr. Osmeña mentioned, these were in effect rewards rather than grant proposals. The awards were made based on what colleges had already done. So the Hartnell College Monterey Bay program really is a model program, but it wasn't created as a result of the awards. They received an award because they had already innovated and created this program. There are two reports scheduled in the legislation. The first one is due in January 2018, and the second one in January 2020, and that is when the recipients are supposed to give an assessment of the impacts. Until then, we don't have clear evidence that these programs have had any sort of statewide impact.
I'm just curious to see how many actual graduates we've been able to produce from these so-called innovation grants.
And I think, just to add one more point, that the number of graduates and the additional degree completion was one of the outcomes, I think, in talking to applicants and the range of institutions that submitted applications. One of the things that they found valuable out of this effort was the idea that individual faculty and administrators and other staff could be recognized for work that isn't often professionally recognized, kind of a focus on student success and these types of metrics resulted in some cultural change, or at least raised the profile of individuals who might not otherwise be professionally supported in these kinds of efforts.
Thank you. Senator Nielsen.
I recently toured a Veterans Resource Center at one of our community colleges. Can anyone give me a little report on any of the successes out there? The Assembly has put about $15 million in for the Veterans Resource Centers. This community college, I believe, funded it out of their existing resources. But anybody have any information on that?
I could provide a little background on Veterans Resource Centers. They typically provide a range of student services, including academic counseling, tutoring, assistance coordinating veterans benefits, social support, and mental health services. And a number of colleges have established these centers, as you mentioned, using either local resources, federal grants, philanthropic funds, and as well student support resources, existing student support service resources from the state. Not all the colleges have centers, and some existing centers don't have the capacity to meet all the demand that they're reporting. But many of them have established centers with existing resources.
Would the Assembly program here then would be the first time state dollars then that went out, or that would be dedicated solely for this purpose, not just to the campuses, and then campuses prioritized out of their discretionary revenue? Is this sort of a categorical grant?
To my knowledge, it would be the first time that funds were designated specifically for Veterans Resource Centers.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Leno.
Ms. Costa, just wanted to get your response from the LAO's point that these awards were granted for work already done, so there's no incentivizing about it, no innovating about it. This work had already been done in the regular course of business, so why would we extend all of this money?
Many of the award winners are using the one-time funds to expand these program offerings into other areas. So the analyst is correct in that they were already using their discretionary funding for these great purposes, and the one-time money allows them to expand the program or even possibly create another one based on what they've learned.
So, for example, you'd mentioned the program which was very successful in providing assistance for additional engineering graduates. How many graduates from that engineering program are we talking about?
I don't think I have the number off the top of my head. If I recall correctly, which I would like the ability to come back with additional information if my recollection isn't correct, they had several cohorts in this program. I want to say they had 4 or 5 different cohorts. So this was a more mature program, and we can get the exact number of students to you.
Okay. And do you feel any of this additional request for $25 million premature, in that we, in the legislation 2 years ago, 3 years ago, required reports back so that we could see how effective they have been, and that you see no need to wait for us to learn from those reports before we invest more money in them?
I think based on the initial number of applications that we received through the first round of funding, there are plenty of innovative programs. I'd note that this proposal is slightly different than our previous proposal in that it's happening within the community college system. Versus our previous innovation awards were across the public segments. And again, targeted to the segment that serves the most students in California, and the hope that we can find some innovative programs, especially given our recent significant investments in the community college system around basic skills and other areas in which we're really trying to get at this transfer rate in community college and completion rate for certificate programs.
I would just suggest, given that you seem very convinced of the value of the original $50 million investment and a further investment of $25 million, that if you could, and that we're not even going to wait for the reports in 18 and 19 to come back before we invest more, according to your proposal, that you could provide us with significantly more detail as to what we've gotten aside from collaboration across segments. I mean, we really need something more than that.
We'd be happy to provide you with additional information, Senator.
Thank you.
Just following along Senator Leno's questioning, both Ms. Costa and Ms. Hyman, rather than doing the $25 million for innovation awards, why not identify the actual awardees to add some transparency so that we actually know where the money's going? For example, we identified one of your grantees, which is the Long Beach Promise, and identified $15 million of support for a California Promise to continue the innovation and expand that innovative program. I know Senator Lauer is very familiar with that program, but why not identify that approach rather than have a $25 million in a block grant that we could actually look at where specifically the money's going and what programs are being identified as innovative?
One distinction I would make, and then I'll turn it over to the analysts, is that through the innovation awards, both our previous proposal and this, they were much broader based than just a Promise program. And although we did recognize the Long Beach Promise, there are a variety, and Christian can remind me of the particular categories that we had, all really aimed at helping improve the 4-year graduation rate, whereas the proposal for the $15 million is for one particular approach that has proven successful. I think part of our desire was to really look across the state and across the segments to look at a variety of innovative approaches that might be applicable statewide.
Ms. Hyman?
No additional information on that. Both proposals are similar in that they would result in funding a few colleges to do some sort of model program.
But why not, instead of having just a block grant program, why not identify and bring those programs forward as part of that budget process? That
would be an option. Yeah.
Okay. Senator Lara?
Yeah, and just to close on the Long Beach Promise, I do know it very well, but in my hat as a conferee, I also know that these programs have come to fruition without any of these monies before, and they're being replicated. I know at Sacramento, San Francisco, and these Promise programs that we want to replicate have come into fruition without any additional innovation grants. I mean, it's just trying to save money here and trying to justify the expenditures that we're making.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the committee? Okay, with that, we'll move to issue 9, community colleges trailer bill language. Ms. Hyman.
The governor proposes to allocate 60% of the $200 million strong workforce funding directly to community college districts and 40% to regional planning groups. The Senate approves as proposed, and the Assembly proposes instead a 75-25 split on strong workforce funds to districts and the regional groups, respectively. Under all three proposals, planning for workforce programs would occur through regional groups that consist of community college districts, local education agencies, universities, civic groups, local workforce boards, labor groups, employers, and other stakeholders. And the purpose of allocating a portion of funding directly to those regional groups is twofold. It's to encourage collaboration across sectors and also to ensure that funds are used to meet the highest regional needs and priorities. This emphasis on both collaboration and regional approach is consistent with the recommendations of the Board of Governors Strong Workforce Task Force, the state's Strategic Workforce Development Plan, and your own actions in recent years to encourage collaboration across sectors for adult education and career technical education programs. In addition to the strong workforce proposal, the Assembly proposes to extend City College of San Francisco Enrollment Funding Restoration Authority for 5 additional years. And I can explain a little bit more about how that works. Under current law, a community college district may earn back apportionment funding that it lost due to a decline in enrollment if its enrollment recovers within 3 years. Following an accreditation scare in 2013, City College of San Francisco has lost about 1/3 of its enrollment. The district is working to rebuild enrollment, but estimates that it'll take several years to get back up to its previous levels. Under current law, 2016-17 would be the last year that City College has to earn back that enrollment revenue. The district has requested a longer period to earn back funding associated with the enrollment decline, and the Assembly action would give it 5 additional years. The Senate subcommittee didn't have a proposal in this area, but legislation passed in the Senate yesterday, Senator Leno's SB 1460, which would provide 3 additional years of restoration funding. It's important to note that the district would receive this funding only to the extent that it actually achieves growth. And in fact, to the extent that it achieves growth above the normal enrollment growth level that you fund through the budget process. So any fiscal impact is projected to be minimal, with potential costs, if any, estimated in the low millions of dollars. And then the last proposal is that the Assembly adds college bookstores to members of interdisciplinary teams implementing the zero textbook cost degree programs.
Thank you. Ms. Costa.
Thank you. I'll start with the Strong Workforce CTE program. I'd note that the Senate has supported some of our proposal, which includes the funding split of 60-40 between the college and the regions. We don't support either of the houses. For the Senate package, there's a difference in the amount of money that's ongoing versus one time within those amounts, and how the career pathways would be treated. We are not proposing a definitive timeline for folding that particular program into the broader CTE. For the San Francisco City College issue, as the analyst notes, there is legislation right now, and so at this point we support the Senate version, which does not include funding for this. And then lastly, for zero textbook cost degrees, we support the Senate version.
Okay, thank you. Questions or comments? Senator Lara.
Thank you. I have a question for the LEO. I know on the Assembly version, we want to allow college bookstores to be involved in the development of zero textbook cost degree. What is your opinion on that? It just seems to me that the bookstores, what role do you think they can play or add to this study?
Bookstores can have an important role in zero textbook cost degree initiatives. Bookstores often are where students learn about what books are required for their courses. They show up at the bookstore with their course list, and the bookstore can direct them and let them know what the options are, which course sections offer zero textbook cost and which sections have textbooks. In addition, the bookstores often can provide low-cost printed versions of electronic materials in the zero textbook cost degree programs. Under these programs, students could use the information purely on electronic devices. Many times students prefer to print out materials, and the bookstores can do that for them more cheaply than they probably could themselves.
If I may, Mr. Chair, we just note on that issue of the language, we believe that our draft would allow a representative to participate in this, and so this is unnecessary.
Thank you. Any other? Senator Leno.
Thank you. Ms. Costa, I'm aware that on the Strong Workforce CTE program that the Senate used finances language on the 60-40% split. Can you give us your argument for why there's a benefit for a larger percentage going to the regions?
Absolutely. I think a key underpinning of this particular proposal is really leveraging the WIOA model and moving to a more regional model for delivery to ensure that local community colleges aren't duplicating the services that are offered. And so we simply want the funding to align to the policy goals, which is really moving towards more coordination, frankly, within regions.
Thank you. And Ms. Hyman, any thoughts on that?
Well, both proposals do direct some funding to regions, and
but the higher percentage for regions?
In general, the higher percentage that you would allocate to regions, the greater the incentive for them to work together and collaborate, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, seeing no further comments or questions, issue 10, University of California enrollment. Mr. Constantoros.
Hi, Jason Constantoros, LEO. Before we jump into issue 10, we did prepare a high-level two-page overview of the university budgets, starting on page 38. I'd be happy to walk through that overview very quickly if that's of assistance.
Feel free. Thank you.
Absolutely. Starting on page 38, that goes over the key issues, key funding differences for the University of California. The governor's 2016-17 budget plan provides UC with $3.5 billion in general fund. That represents a $212 million increase over 2015-16. The key component of that increase is a 4% base increase to UC, equaling $125 million. The remaining funding is for one-time purposes. Both houses adopted the governor's funding level and in addition provided additional funding to UC. Specifically, the Assembly provides UC $61 million more than the governor. The Senate provides UC $56 million more than the governor. In addition, the Assembly plan also includes a language that would require UC to both redirect funding, incur additional savings, and increase non-resident supplemental tuition. As a result of that, that would account for $61 million more. In terms of funding, just the general fund doesn't look terribly different, and both houses identify similar priorities. They identify funding, enrollment, research, and student outreach. But because the Assembly also includes funding from other sources, the Assembly plan has funding for additional priorities beyond enrollment, more so than the Senate. Moving on to page 39. That covers CSU. The governor's 2016-17 plan provides CSU also with a $3.5 billion general fund. That represents $198 million more than 2015-16. Similar to UC, the key component of the governor's plan is a base increase for CSU, equaling $148 million. Most of the remaining funding is for retiree health and one-time purposes. The houses look a little bit more different for CSU in terms of funding. The Assembly provides CSU $128 million more in ongoing funding, but $25 million less in one-time funding. The Assembly plan essentially meets a budget request made by the CSU trustees in November. The Senate, by contrast, provides the same level of ongoing funding and $10 million more in one-time funding than the governor. Both houses identify enrollment as a key priority, but they are different in terms of the enrollment they establish. The Assembly provides for more enrollment growth than the Senate, and you'll have an opportunity to explore that in the following issues. That concludes just the high-level overview. I'd be happy to answer any questions or move on to issue 10.
Feel free to go to issue 10.
Great. Issue 10 pertains to 2017-18 enrollment for UC. There are basically three areas of differences I wanted to highlight for this item. The first regards resident enrollment. Both houses set resident enrollment targets for 2017-18. That's the budget year plus one. The reason for that is last year's budget already set 2016-17 resident targets for UC, and UC asserts that it's on track to meet those targets. The Senate would provide for 4,000 undergraduate residents, more than 2016-17. The Senate would provide for 5,000 residents over 2016-17. We would just note that this difference, 1,000 student difference, isn't terribly significant if you compare it to UC's overall enrollment. It's less than 1%. So, and enrollment isn't an exact science, so there isn't necessarily one right level to go between the two houses. The second area of difference is non-resident enrollment. The Senate did not make assumptions regarding non-resident enrollment. The Assembly did. The Assembly plan calls for UC to reduce non-resident enrollment by 1,700 students in 2017-18 over 2016-17 levels. Non-resident enrollment has been a key concern of the state in recent years. On the one hand, non-resident students take up physical space that could result in taking up a seat that could be available for a resident student. On the other hand, non-resident students also provide funding above and beyond the cost of instruction that go to subsidize UC's other cost increases, including resident enrollment. Because these two issues work at cross purposes, it can be very difficult to determine the overall effect of non-resident enrollment on resident enrollment. We think the Assembly is, it's reasonable that it would include non-resident enrollment as part of the overall budget. We appreciate that there could be some concern with foregone revenue, and if there is a concern, one alternative approach could be to simply cap non-resident enrollment, and that would prevent any foregone revenue. And then finally, the third difference is the actual sources of how each house pays for their proposals. The Senate provides general fund to cover enrollment growth. It's of $40 million. The Assembly, by contrast, shares that cost through different sources. So it includes $20 million for general fund, but also another $20 million from redirected funding from certain UC programs. I'd be happy to elaborate on that more if there's interest in that. And also $40 million from an increase in non-resident supplemental tuition. And we think that the Assembly's approach here, again, it's reasonable that you would consider all of UC's sources of funding and costs when you're doing budget planning. In recent years, UC has been including savings and non-resident tuition as part of its budget planning as well. So the one comment we would make is that the legislature as a whole ensure that whatever UC is redirecting funding away from isn't a priority for the legislature. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Costa.
Yes, we don't support either of the proposals. I would note in the current year budget, we did provide increased enrollment for the University of California, and additionally, we funded a eligibility study for the segments of higher education, asking the Office of Planning and Research to evaluate the admission policies used by both UC and CSU, and to determine the number of students eligible. So we believe that study can better inform discussions around enrollment going forward.
Questions or comments from the committee? Ms. Olson.
Thank you. I'll begin with a question to the comment just made by Ms. Costa with Department of Finance. The study that the governor's proposal calls for, what do you anticipate to come out of that study that perhaps wasn't already discovered in the state auditor's work?
So this is actually was funded in the current year budget. I believe it was a Senate proposal and in last year's budget that we funded. part of the question for the study is to really determine admissions policies and how that's driving the eligibility within both UC and CSU, as well as to try and determine the number of students that we think are eligible for the segments. And so our point with increased funding for enrollment would simply be to utilize that data, which we will be getting in December of 2016, to inform how we want to think about it going forward.
I see. So one of the outcomes is we're supposed to be given a number of California students who are eligible but who are not currently being admitted into the systems?
Yes, before the California Post-Secondary Education Commission ceased to exist, they often performed these eligibility studies, and in the absence of that, this is kind of the next iteration of that. And traditionally, those studies help determine whether or not the segments were meeting the eligibility thresholds defined in the master plan for higher education.
Okay, thank you.
This is slightly different. There's a little bit more detail, I think, in this study.
Okay, thank you. And then with that, I'll just make a comment that the Assembly version of the plan, has been a very high bipartisan priority in the Assembly this year, a bipartisan priority in the Higher Education Committee as well. This morning, as we were sitting in Budget Conference Committee, AB 1711 by Kevin McCarty, of which I'm a co-author, did pass with unanimous bipartisan support. I think it's very important we restate the mission through our budget planning, that the mission of the University of California is to prioritize California students. And the auditor's report made it quite clear that California students are being harmed by a greater focus on enrolling non-resident students. So I encourage the conference committee to pass the Assembly version of this particular issue.
Thank you, Assembly Member. Other questions, comments? I'll make a quick comment as well on the Assembly version. Part of this was born out of a concern. Well, just to answer the question, the eligibility study was a proposal that I championed a couple of years ago. I think it's fabulous that we are doing it. However, I don't think that we should really wait for the study to be done to really act. I think that the goal of the eligibility study was to really give us a sense of the number of students, high school students, that were eligible for UC, CSU for the different segments, to ensure that we have enough slots for all of them. Having said that, during the same time that we've seen challenges regarding the recession, we've seen UC it go from about a 5% out-of-state admissions and enrollment to now a 15% enrollment, where traditionally the master plan was calling for about 10%. So our plan really tries to move UC back in line with the 10% out-of-state enrollment targets. At the same time, by increasing fees on out-of-state enrollments, we can figure out how to pay for half the cost rather than having the general fund bear that cost. We also felt that UC should share in some of that cost, given the fact that the Office of the President budget alone is over almost $700 million, far greater than the legislature, far greater than the Assembly or the Senate. So given the high administrative overhead from Office of the President, we felt the least that the Office of the President could do was share some of that cost and really helping fund in-state students. So with that, seeing no other comments or questions, we'll move on to issue 11, CSU enrollment.